Adelaide Boucher stood barefoot on the rotting boards of the Pointe-à-Marais ferry landing, clutching her two small children against her hip. The brown water of the bayou moved past slow and patient, the way grief moves. Parish folk filed past her in their Sunday black, their eyes sliding away like fish in shallow water. No one stopped. No one spoke. "No one wants us," she whispered into the thick spring air. "Not one soul in this whole parish wants us." Theo, her 8-year-old boy, pressed his face into her skirt. Lila, just 5, had not made a sound in 2 days. The little girl's bare feet were filthy and the soles were cracked. A heron lifted off a half-sunk cypress stump and beat its slow wings south. Then from the green shadows where the cypress knees rose out of the water like old men's knuckles, a flat-bottomed pirogue slid into the light. A tall man stood in the back of it, poling with the easy rhythm of someone who had been born to that water. He wore a long oilcloth coat the color of wet bark. His face was shadowed by a battered felt hat, and when he spoke his voice was low and quiet, the way a man speaks who does not need volume to be heard. "I do." Adelaide turned, her arms tightening around her children. "Ma'am," the man said, lifting the brim of his hat just enough that she could see his eyes, a deep, steady brown, the color of river silt. "I heard what you said. I do. I want you. I have a place. You and them babies come with me." The Louisiana Bayou country in the spring of 1893 was a place that did not forgive weakness, and Adelaide Boucher had been stripped of every kind of strength a woman could lose. 6 weeks earlier she had been the wife of the parish levee engineer. She had been a school teacher's wife, and a mother and a woman with a house painted the color of fresh cream. Now she stood barefoot on a ferry landing, and a stranger in an oilcloth coat was offering her a roof. The townspeople kept walking. Not one of them turned around. 6 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday night thick with thunder, the Pointe-à-Marais levee had given way. Adelaide's husband, Etienne Boucher, had been out on the crown of it in the rain, lantern in hand, walking the length the way he walked it every spring. He was a careful man. He kept a notebook in his coat pocket and a stub of pencil tucked behind his ear, and he wrote down every measurement and every weak place he found. The river took him some time after midnight. They found his lantern 3 days later, tangled in a sweet gum branch a mile downstream. They never found him. 38 other souls drowned that night, whole families. The Robichaud children, old Madame Picou, who had taught Adelaide her catechism. The parish wore black for a month, and the church bell rang at every dawn. Adelaide had grieved the way a woman grieves when her whole life has been pulled out from under her, and she had not been ready for what came next. What came next was a man in a fine gray suit named Cyril Devereux. He owned the shipping line that ran out of the parish wharves, and he owned the cotton presses, and he owned, it was whispered, the parish judge himself. He came to Adelaide's door 3 weeks after the flood with a leather portfolio and a sympathetic frown. "Mrs. Boucher," he said, "it grieves me to bring this to you in your time of sorrow, but your husband owed the Devereux Shipping Company a great deal of money. Gambling debts, I'm afraid, riverboat losses." He signed these notes over the past 2 years. He spread the papers on her kitchen table. Adelaide stared at them. Her husband's signature was on every page. Her husband had never touched a card in his life. Her husband had been a Methodist who would not even take coffee on the Sabbath. "This is a lie," she said. "Every word of this is a lie. Judge Lanier has already reviewed and stamped these notes," Devereux said gently. "The cottage and the schoolhouse will be forfeit by the end of the month. I am sorry, I truly am." He left his card on her table. Adelaide tore it in half. She went to Judge Auguste Lanier in his oak-paneled chambers, and she begged him to look again. The judge folded his soft white hands and told her the law was the law. She went to the parish priest, Father Mouton, and the priest looked at his shoes and said he would pray for her. She went to the sheriff, and the sheriff said it was a civil matter. She went finally to her neighbors, the baker, the apothecary, the woman who had stood beside her at every funeral that spring. Every door she knocked on opened just a crack, and every face behind every door looked past her shoulder, down the river, in the direction of the Devereux wharves. The parish folk looked the other way down the river. They were good at it. They had been practicing for a long time. By the fourth day after the eviction, Adelaide had begged at every door in Pointe-à-Marais. She had begged the baker, Monsieur Hebert, who had eaten at her table a dozen times. He had given her half a loaf of stale bread and shut his shutters. She had begged the apothecary, who had sold tonics to her husband for his cough, and the apothecary had told her kindly enough that his wife was afraid of what Mr. Devereux might do. She had begged Father Mouton again, on her knees on the church steps, and Father Mouton had given her a rosary and a blessing and turned away. Theo's bare feet were bleeding. Leila had stopped speaking entirely. They had slept 2 nights under the loading platform behind the cotton press, and on the 3rd night a dock watchman had chased them off with a length of rope. On the morning of the 4th day, Adelaide carried her daughter down to the ferry landing, because she did not know where else to go. The water was the only thing in Pointe-à-Marais that had not refused her. She set Leila down on the warm boards, and she looked at her son, at the dirt smudged across his pale cheeks, and she felt something inside her chest crack like a piece of dry kindling. "No one wants us," she whispered to the slow brown water. That was when the pirogue came out of the cypress shadows. Remy Thibodeau was known in Pointe-à-Marais the way a stretch of dark water is known. People spoke of him in lowered voices. He was a Cajun swamp guide who lived alone on a stilted houseboat somewhere back in the cypress breaks where the channels grew narrow and the moss hung low. He hunted alligator for the hides, and he ran trot lines for catfish, and he came into town maybe 4 times a year to trade for coffee and powder and salt. He was tall and lean and weather-burned. There was a long, shiny burn scar that ran from the back of his right wrist halfway up to his elbow, pale against the brown of his forearm, and the parish folk whispered it was from a powder flash or a barn fire, or worse. He stepped out of the pirogue onto the landing, and the boards groaned under his weight. He did not look at the watching townsfolk. He looked at Adelaide. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Remy Thibodeau. I have a houseboat about 2 hours back in the cypress. It ain't much. It got a tin roof and a good stove and a door that locks. The water don't get in, and there ain't nobody back there to tell you to leave." A small crowd had gathered now. They watched from a careful distance. Monsieur Hebert, the baker, was among them. So was the apothecary's wife. Adelaide could not make her mouth work. She looked at the man's burn scar and at his quiet brown eyes and at the worn handle of the knife on his belt, and she was afraid. "Why?" she finally said. "Why would you take us? We have nothing. We can't pay you. We can't." Remy crouched down slowly so that he was at eye level with Theo and Leila. He reached into the deep pocket of his oilcloth coat and brought out 2 small twists of brown paper. Pralines, sticky with cane syrup. He held them out on his open palm. Theo looked at his mother. Adelaide gave the smallest nod. The boy took one. After a moment, Leila reached out and took the other, and it was the first movement she had made of her own free will in 2 days. Remy stood back up. He was a head and a half taller than any man on the landing. He did not raise his voice, but he spoke just loud enough that every soul on those boards could hear him. "Out here on this water," he said, "a man is measured by who he carries and who he leaves behind, not by whose boots he licks. And I will tell you all what I learned a long time ago. A woman holding 2 hungry babies on a public landing while a whole parish walks past. That is the kind of thing a place don't ever wash clean of. You hear me? The river remembers." He turned back to Adelaide. "Gather what you got, ma'am. We need to be back in the breaks before sundown. The mosquitoes get mean after dark." Adelaide had nothing to gather. She had a carpet bag with 2 changes of clothes for the children and a small tin music box that had been her husband's mother's. She lifted Leila into her arms, and she took Theo's hand, and she stepped down into the pirogue with a man whose name she had only just learned. The townsfolk watched her go. Not one of them said goodbye. The journey back into the cypress breaks took the better part of the afternoon. Remy ploughed the pirogue with a quiet, unhurried strength, threading the long, flat boat through channels that narrowed and twisted until Adelaide could no longer tell which way the sun was. Spanish moss hung in grey curtains from the branches overhead. A water snake unspooled itself off a half-sunk log and slid into the dark. Once, a bull alligator surfaced 10 feet off the bow, a row of armored back and a single yellow eye, and Remy gave it a long, calm look until it sank again. "He knows me," Remy said softly. "We got an understanding." Theo was riveted. The boy had not let go of his mother's sleeve, but his eyes were enormous, and Adelaide could see the smallest flicker of something in them that she had not seen since the night the levee broke. Curiosity, the faintest cousin of hope, the houseboat sat in a wide, quiet pool where 4 channels met, raised up on heavy cypress pilings a good 6 feet above the black water. It had a tin roof gone soft green with age and a covered porch wrapped around 2 sides. Bundles of herbs hung drying from the porch beams. A long swamp rifle rested on 2 pegs above the door. The whole thing was kept with the careful neatness of a man who lived by himself and did not have anyone to blame his messes on. Inside it was a single long room, a cast-iron stove, a plank table, a bunk built into the back wall, piled with clean wool blankets, a second cot rolled up in the corner, shelves of dry goods in tin canisters, every one of them labeled in a careful hand, a washstand with a chipped enamel basin, the smell of wood smoke and dried bay leaves and old coffee. "You and the little one take the bunk," Remy said. "The boy can have the cot." "I sleep on the porch most nights anyway. I prefer it. Mr. Thibodeau. Remy. Remy, we can't put you out of your own bed." He looked at her, and there was something almost shy in his quiet brown eyes. The burn scar on his forearm caught the lantern light. "Ma'am," he said, "you ain't putting me out of nothing. You are my guests. Now sit down. I got a pot of red beans been simmering since dawn in them. Babies need to eat." The first week passed in a slow, careful rhythm. Adelaide, who could not bear to be idle, took over the cooking and the mending. She scrubbed the plank table until the cypress grain shone. She washed Remy's 2 spare shirts and patched the worn elbows. Theo shadowed Remy everywhere. The man had a saint's patience with the boy. He showed Theo how to read the muddy prints along the water's edge, raccoon, mink, the curling drag mark of a small gator. He showed him how to set a crawfish trap and how to mind the lines and how to tell, by the way the moss moved, which way the wind was about to turn. Lila adored him without speaking. She would crawl up next to him on the porch in the evenings and lean against his side, and he would let her, and once Adelaide came out and found the little girl asleep with her cheek pressed against that long burn scar as if it were the softest pillow in the world. By lantern light on the 5th night, with the children sleeping, Adelaide finally asked him, "Remy, how did you come to live back here all alone?" He was quiet for a long time. He sat with his big hands wrapped around a tin cup of chicory. The lantern flame stood very still. "I had a brother," he said, "Mathis. He was 19. He worked the levee crews for the parish, same as your husband, only he was a laborer, not an engineer, just a boy with a strong back." Adelaide's breath caught. "He died in the break," she whispered. "He died in the break." Remy looked out the open door into the dark water and the soft chorus of frogs. "I was downriver that night. I had a string of trot lines I was minding. I heard the roar and I poled hard, but by the time I got to the cut, it was already done. I pulled 3 bodies out of the water before sunrise." Mathis was the 4th. He turned the tin cup slowly in his hands. "They said it was the storm. They said the river just took the levee. I didn't believe it then, and I don't believe it now. Etienne Boucher was a careful man, ma'am. Everybody on the water knew it. A careful man don't lose a levee to one spring storm." Somebody did something to that wall. Adelaide reached across the plank table without thinking. She laid her hand over the long burn scar on his forearm. His skin was warm. He went very still. "I came back here after Mathis," he said quietly. "I figured I'd be a ghost the rest of my days. Wasn't but 2 months ago I told myself I was done with people. And then I pulled up to that landing 6 days ago to trade a hide for some salt. And I heard a woman whisper to the river that nobody wanted her. And I thought," his voice went rough, "I thought my brother would have wanted me to say something." Adelaide did not move her hand. The frogs sang. Somewhere far back in the cypress, an owl called once. "I'm glad you did," she said. It was the music box that broke the thing open. Remy had been gone since first light, out checking the trot lines on the far side of the pool. Adelaide was hanging, wash on the porch line. Theo was down on the small dock with a hand line. Lila sat cross-legged on the cabin floor with her father's tin music box in her lap, turning the little brass key the way her papa had shown her, listening to the slow tinkling lullaby it played. It was a French cradle song. Etienne had wound it for her every night of her short life. The music box slipped. It struck the plank floor on its corner with a small bright sound, and the lid sprang open at a wrong angle. and the soft red velvet that lined the inside of the lid peeled away from the tin. "Mama," Lila said. It was the first word she had spoken in 9 days. "Mama, it's broke." Adelaide came in fast, her hands wet from the wash water. She knelt down. The little girl's lower lip was trembling. "Oh, baby. Oh, sweet girl, we can fix it. Look, Mama can fix it." She lifted the music box gently. The velvet lining had come loose, and beneath it, folded into a tight square no larger than a playing card, was a piece of fine onion skin paper. Adelaide's hands went cold. She unfolded it slowly on the plank table. It was a blueprint, drawn in her husband's meticulous hand. The Pointe-a-Marais levee, in cross-section, every measurement, every iron tie rod, every clay course, every drainage culvert. And along the bottom third, in red pencil, Etienne had drawn a row of small, careful circles where the tie rods should have been, and beside each circle, the same 2 words, repeated 9 times. "Rods removed." And at the very bottom of the page, in Etienne's small, neat hand, "Removal authorized by Devereux Shipping per Judge A. Lanier. Insurance claim filed 3 months prior to spring rise. Will deliver findings to Corps of Engineers at New Orleans on May 14th. May 14th, Etienne had drowned on May 11th. Adelaide pressed both her hands flat against the plank table and tried to breathe. They had killed him. They had not just stolen his name and his cottage and his good standing. They had killed him. They had pulled the iron out of the levee for the insurance money and the rebuilding contracts, and when Etienne had figured it out and meant to take the proof north to the Corps, they had made sure the river took him before he could 38 people. Madame Picou. The Robichaud children, all of them dead, so that Cyril Devereux could claim insurance and bid on the rebuild. A long shadow fell across the porch boards. Adelaide looked up. 3 men stood on the dock. Not Remy. The man in front was broad and red-faced, with a knife on his belt and a pistol stuck in his waistband. Behind him in the pool sat a small steam launch. Its boiler ticking, 2 more men aboard. She knew the lead man by sight. His name was Boudreau. He ran Devereux's dock cruise. Mrs. Boucher Boudreau said, "Mr. Devereux sent us to collect some papers your late husband had. We know you got him. The swamp man can't hide you forever, ma'am. Hand him over and we leave peaceable." "Don't." And this tin roof shack goes up like a dry corn shuck. Adelaide moved fast. She folded the blueprint into the bodice of her dress. She pulled Leela behind her and shouted for Theo, who came running up the dock with his eyes wide. She pushed both children into the bunk and pulled the wool blankets over them. "You stay," she whispered. "You stay and you do not make a sound. No matter what you hear." She took the long swamp rifle down off the pegs above the door. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the lever. But she could work it. Etienne had taught her on Sunday afternoons. "I'm coming in, Mrs. Boucher," Boudreau called. He stepped up onto the porch. The boards groaned. He never got to the door. A pirogue came out of the cypress on the far side of the pool, low and fast and silent as a shadow. Remy stood in the back of it, poling with a long, terrible economy of motion, and his face was not the quiet face Adelaide had come to know. His face was the face of a man who had been waiting a long time for this exact moment. He grounded the pirogue against the pilings of the houseboat, without a sound. He came up the back ladder. Boudreau was still hammering on the front door. Adelaide heard the first man go into the water. It was a clean, wet sound, like a sack of flour dropped off a wagon. The second man shouted and got off one wild pistol shot that went straight up through the porch roof. And then there was another wet sound, and then a third. Adelaide pressed her back against the inside of the door, the rifle shaking in her hands, and she listened. Boudreau was screaming now. Not threats, just screaming. Boudreau, Remy's voice said, quiet, almost gentle. "Boudreau, look at me." The screaming stopped. "You go back to Cyril Devereux," Remy said, "and you tell him the Boucher family is under my roof now. You tell him this water out here belongs to me, every black inch of it, and any man he sends back into these channels is going to feed my gators. You hear me, Boudreau? You nod if you hear me." There was a pause. "Good. Now you swim." "The launch is 200 yards. You'll make it if you don't stop." Adelaide opened the door. Remy stood on the porch, soaked to the waist, the long burn scar livid against his wet skin. Two of Devereux's men were already swimming for the launch, one of them clutching a shattered jaw. Boudreaux was in the water at the foot of the steps, gasping. Remy looked up at Adelaide, and his quiet brown eyes searched her face. "They didn't touch you?" "No. The babies in the bunk. They're all right." He came up the steps and took the rifle gently out of her hands, and only then did Adelaide realize she was crying. "I found something," she said. "Remy, I found something." They sat at the plank table by the light of 2 lanterns, and Adelaide watched Remy's face as he read her husband's blueprint. His jaw worked once. He laid the onion skin paper down very carefully on the cypress wood, as if it were a living thing he did not want to startle. He put his big hands flat on the table on either side of it. He closed his eyes. "Mathis," he said softly. Just the one word. Adelaide reached across and laid her hand over his again. "We have to take this somewhere," she said. "Remy, we have to take this somewhere. They cannot bury it." Parish laws bought Adelaide. Judge Lanier signed off on pulling the rods. Sheriff drinks at Devereux's table every Friday. "We walk this paper into the parish courthouse and it goes in the stove. Then somewhere higher." "Higher." He opened his eyes. "There's a man, Captain Hollis Granger, United States Army Corps of Engineers, posted out of New Orleans. I pulled him out of a flooded culvert in the high water of '89 when nobody else would go in after him. He told me then if I ever needed a favor in this life, I had one coming. Can we get to him? Not through the parish. Devereux's got men on every road between here and the river mouth. But there's a back way. 3 nights of poling through channels nobody runs but me. Comes out at the telegraph station in Morgan City. From Morgan City, a wire to New Orleans is the work of an hour. 3 nights with the children." Remy looked at her steadily. "The children come with us. I will not leave them on this houseboat after what happened today. Boudreaux will go back to Devereux, and Devereux will send a launch with a torch in the bow before the week is out. We move tonight, they moved at moonrise." The journey through the back channels was a thing Adelaide would remember for the rest of her life. Remy plowed, standing up hour after hour, the muscles of his shoulders working under the wet cloth of his shirt. He never lit a lantern. He read the water by starlight and by the smell of it and by some long quiet knowing she could not name. Theo curled up in the bow with one of Remy's wool blankets and slept the sleep of a boy who had decided, finally, that he was safe. Lilla slept in Adelaide's lap, and Adelaide kept one hand on the folded blueprint in her bodice the whole way. On the second night, deep in a black channel where the cypresses closed overhead like a church roof, Remy stopped polling. The pirogue drifted. He came forward and crouched beside her. His face was very close in the dark. "Adelaide," he said, "if this goes wrong in Morgan City, if Devereux's men are waiting, I want you to know something." "Don't," she said. "Don't talk like that. I want you to know something." His voice was very gentle. "I came back to the living because of you. Whatever happens past tomorrow night, I came back." "That's a thing you gave me." I wanted to say it out loud while I had the chance. She put both her hands on his face in the dark. "You come back to that houseboat with us, Remy Thibodeau. You hear me? You come back." "Yes, ma'am." They reached Morgan City on the 3rd dawn, grey and exhausted and stinking of swamp water. Remy sent the wire himself in a code he and Captain Granger had agreed on years before. The answer came back inside 2 hours. "Warrant secured this morning. Judge Eustace, Federal District, New Orleans. Marshals dispatched by rail. Corps Inspector accompanying. Meet at Pointe Marais Memorial, May 11th, 10 o'clock. Hold the paper. Granger." May 11th, the 1-year memorial of the levee break. Adelaide folded the telegram into her bodice next to the blueprint. She looked up at Remy. "They will all be there," she said. "Every soul in the parish. Devereux will be on the platform. Lanier will be on the platform. Then that," Remy said quietly, "is where the river gets to remember out loud. May 11th came up hot and bright and full of cicadas. The parish had built a low pine platform on the crown of the rebuilt levee, exactly above the place where the wall had given way 1 year before. Bunting hung from the rails. A small brass band played a slow hymn. The whole town had turned out in Sunday black. The Robichaud family stood near the front. What was left of them? Madame Picou's nephew, the widows, the fatherless children. They held white lilies, and they wept openly. Judge Auguste Lanier stood on the platform in a fine black coat, his soft white hands folded over a leather Bible. Beside him stood Cyril Devereux in a grey suit and a black mourning band, his head bowed at exactly the angle a grieving man's head ought to be bowed. "Beloved neighbors," Devereux was saying, his voice carrying out over the bowed heads. "1 year ago today, the river took from us what no man can replace. We could not have known, we could not have prevented, but we can today rededicate ourselves to the rebuilding of this great parish." The crowd parted. Adelaide Boucher walked up the grass slope of the levee with her 2 children at her sides. She wore the same dress she had stood in on the ferry landing, washed and pressed, but still the same dress. Theo's small hand was in her right hand. Lila's was in her left. Behind her, a step back, came Remy Thibodeau in his oilcloth coat, the long swamp rifle slung across his back, his quiet brown eyes fixed on the platform. Devereux's voice faltered. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Lanier said sharply. Sheriff, remove these people." The parish sheriff stepped forward, his hand on his pistol. He did not get 2 paces from the small crowd on the riverside of the levee. 4 men in long dust coats stepped forward, and every one of them had a federal star pinned to his lapel and a liver-action rifle across his arm. Behind them came a 5th man, older, gray at the temples, in the dark blue coat and brass buttons of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. "Captain Hollis Granger." Sheriff Granger said pleasantly. "You are going to take your hand off that pistol, or my marshals are going to take it off for you. Pick one." The sheriff took his hand off his pistol. Adelaide walked up the steps of the platform. She did not look at Devereux. She did not look at Lanier. She walked to the small lectern, and she turned to face the people of Pointe-Marais, the people who had walked past her on the ferry landing, the people who had shut their doors, the people who had looked the other way down the river. She took the folded blueprint out of her bodice. She unfolded it slowly. She held it up so that the morning sun came through the onion skin and lit the red pintle marks like small wounds. "My husband drew this," she said. Her voice was steady, it carried. "Etienne Boucher drew this 6 weeks before the levee broke. He found that the iron tie rods in this wall had been pulled out on the orders of Cyril Devereux, signed off by Judge Auguste Lanier, for the insurance money and for the rebuilding contracts that came after. He was going to take this paper to the Corps of Engineers in New Orleans on the 14th of May. He died on the 11th. So did 38 of your neighbors. So did Mathis Thibodeau. So did your children. They did not die because the river took them. They died because 2 men on this platform sold their lives for a contract." A sound went through the crowd, not a gasp, something lower, something older. Cyril Devereux moved very fast for a man in a grey suit. His hand went inside his coat and came out with a small nickel-plated pistol, and he was bringing it up toward Adelaide when Remy hit him. Remy did not draw the rifle. He came across the platform in 3 long strides, and he took Cyril Devereux by the front of his fine grey suit, and he lifted him bodily off the boards. The little pistol clattered down the steps. Devereux's polished shoes kicked in the air. Remy walked him to the edge of the levee crown, the edge that looked out over the slow brown water, and Remy stepped off into the river with Cyril Devereux in his hands. They went under together. The water closed over them. The crowd ran to the edge. For one long terrible moment there was nothing. Just the slow brown surface and a single ring of ripples. Then Remy came up. He came up with one hand wrapped around the throat of Cyril Devereux's grey suit, and he held the man's head just above the waterline, the way you hold a fish you have not yet decided to keep. Devereux was choking and gasping and clawing at Remy's wrist. "Cyril," Remy said. His voice was very quiet, and the whole levee heard it. "Cyril, this is the water you drowned my brother in. Now you are going to look up at every face on this bank, and you are going to tell them what you did. Or I'm going to let go of your collar. Pick one." "I did it," Devereux sobbed. "I did it. The rods, the insurance, Lanier signed. I paid him. God forgive me, I paid him." Captain Granger had a notebook out. So did 2 of the marshals. The whole confession came out of Cyril Devereux in the slow brown water in front of every grieving soul in Pointe-Marais, and the river carried every word of it up the bank. When it was done, Remy hauled him to the muddy edge, and the marshals took him by the arms and dragged him up. They put irons on Judge Lanier where he stood. The sheriff laid his pistol down on the platform boards without being asked. The parish folk turned to look at Adelaide, the baker, the apothecary's wife, Father Mouton. They could not meet her eyes. They had practiced for a long time at looking the other way down the river, and now there was nowhere left to look. Adelaide came down off the platform. She did not speak to any of them. She walked to the muddy edge of the levee where Remy was climbing up out of the water, and she took his face in both her hands, and she did not care that he was soaked, and she did not care who was watching. That evening they plowed back into the cypress brakes. The houseboat sat on its stilts in the wide, quiet pool, exactly as they had left it. The herbs hung from the porch beams. The long swamp rifle went back up on its pegs above the door. Theo ran out onto the small dock to see if the crawfish trap had filled. Lila sat down cross-legged on the porch boards and wound her music box, and the slow tinkling French lullaby drifted out over the black water. Remy stood at the porch rail with his back to the cabin, looking out at the cypress. The sun was going down through the moss in long gold bars. His oilcloth coat hung over the rail to dry. The burned scar on his forearm caught the last of the light. Adelaide came out and stood beside him. She did not speak for a long time. The corps inspector said, "The parish owes my family a settlement," she said finally. "For Etienne, for the cottage, for the schoolhouse." He said, "We will not want for anything, the children and I." "That's a good thing, Adelaide. He asked me where to send the papers. I told him to send them here." Remy went very still. He did not turn, Adelaide. "Look at me, Remy Thibodeau." He turned. She took his right hand. She turned it palm up. She laid her own hand flat against the long burned scar, the way Lila had laid her cheek against it that first week, and she pressed. "I do not want a cottage in town," she said. "I do not want a schoolhouse with my name on the deed. I want a tin roof and a stove that draws good, and a porch where my daughter can wind her music box. I want my boy to learn how the moss tells the wind. I want a man who pulls out of the cypress on the worst day of my life and says one word to me. You said it to me, Remy, on the landing. Now I'm saying it to you." His quiet brown eyes filled. "Will you stay?" she whispered. "Will you be a father to my children? Will you be my husband?" The man who had carried 38 bodies in his memory for one whole year, the man who had pulled 3 drowning strangers out of a flooded culvert and his own brother out of a broken levee, the man who had not let himself cry since the night the river took Mathis. The man pressed Adelaide's hand harder against the scar on his forearm, and he wept silently, and he nodded once, and then he found his voice. "I do," Remy Thibodeau said. "God help me, Adelaide. I do." The cicadas sang in the cypress. The music box played its slow French lullaby. Out on the black water, somewhere back in the channels, a bull alligator surfaced once and watched the houseboat with one yellow eye, and then sank again, satisfied. The river had remembered. The river had remembered out loud. And the river, at long last, was quiet,